We are live. Welcome, people, to the Nocturnist conversation. My name is Dr. Laurel Braitman, except I'm a doctor of nothing but ideas, unlike our guest, Emily Silverman, who is a physician and an all-around incredible person and a world maker. But I will also read you her official bio. Emily Silverman is an internal medicine physician at the Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital. She is also the assistant professor of medicine at UCSF and the creator and host of The Nocturnists, which for me is a beloved institution, an independent medical storytelling community that has produced over 24 live shows in the Bay Area and NYC, 3 seasons of a podcast, and 2 audio series, audio diary series, which were incredible, called Stories from a Pandemic and Black Voices in Healthcare. She's also published in the New York Times, McSweeney's, JAMA, and the Examined Life Journal. She loves teaching herself piano and guitar and going on road trips with her husband. And tonight we're going to be in conversation. Sadly, we are missing Dr. Ashley McMullen. Emily, would you say a little bit about Ashley and explain her absence for us, please?
Yes. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We're so sorry that Ashley isn't able to be here. She actually had a death in the family. So she had a family emergency and was so sad that she couldn't come. But we are excited to hold down the fort and to talk about Ashley and how amazing she is and all of the wonderful energy that she brought into the Nocturnist this year, especially with the Black Voices in Healthcare series. So feel free to ask questions about that project, and I will do my best to answer, even though Ashley is not here. So.
Yes, on that note, please, there's nothing weirder than doing a live in conversation event where we cannot see you. So I know 12 of you are out there, maybe 6 of you that aren't us. So please introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us why you're here. Feel free to put a question in a Q&A. We will make your dreams come true in terms of your questions about storytelling and medicine, the Nocturnists, anything in our experiences. I am a professional writer and I also teach writing and storytelling at the Stanford Medical School. So we are here for you tonight and to answer all of your questions. But really, I will just be interviewing Emily. So if you have questions for Emily, please put them in the chat. Feel free to interrupt us. Tell us your stories in chat and we will get caught up as we're talking. So could we start with Black Voices in Healthcare, because that's been the focus of yours in this latter part of the pandemic and also the last 10 episodes of the podcast. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Great.
So, gosh, it's been a year of happenings, of events, many of them just really disturbing to watch. Pandemic, which we can talk about later, but a lot of the dialogue that's been ignited around race and racism in this country, the events of George Floyd's murder at the hands of a white police officer in Minnesota obviously resurrected this conversation. And it was really after that happened that we at the Nocturnists looked around and thought, how do we give voice to the experience of Black healthcare workers, because there's so much richness there, and we really wanted to provide a platform where people who have been historically excluded are able to have their voices centered. So that is how the amazing Dr. Ashley McMullen got involved with the Nocturnists, who, again, for those joining late, sadly couldn't make it here today because of a family emergency. But Ashley and I had known each other all through residency. We were in the same cohort, so we became interns together in 2014, and we were friendly. And then it wasn't until February of this year that we got much more tight, and that was because she submitted a story to be told on stage at the Nocturnists. So we had a live show before the pandemic in January of this year. Gosh, feels like forever ago. But it was at the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, amazing space, like 700 seats. We filled it up with healthcare workers. And Ashley got on stage and told this story about making the decision to stop chemically straightening her hair and to let her hair go natural, and really using that decision as a metaphor or a lens through which to examine kind of coming into herself and her authenticity as a person, but also as a physician. And it was an amazing story and a huge success on stage. And so when this happened in the news, Ashley was one of the first people that I thought of. And I said, hey, would you want to host this series? And she was really into it. And then we were fortunate enough to bring on Kimberly Manning, who's an amazing person, physician, storyteller, leader, based at Emory in Atlanta, Georgia. And so Kimberly produced and Ashley hosted. And basically what happened is every week for 10 weeks, my tiny team and Ashley and Kimberly and a couple of amazing med students, shout out to Rafi and Lauren, would come together and examine the audio material that had come in that week. And each week we had a theme, and we would just talk about the clips and, you know, what stood out. And I just felt like Ashley and Kimberly did an amazing job curating that series, and Ashley hosting the series. And that's how it got started.
If any of you here haven't listened, I really recommend it. Treese says it was on my list long ago, and then I didn't think I could handle it when it all upended this year. I hear you, but also I would really tell you it's also such a joyful series. There's so much beauty and happiness and love in it. The themes range for everything from home to joy to hair. I actually, hair was my favorite episode. I have to say, there was so much vulnerability and tenderness and power and hilarity and pain and beauty in just that one episode. So I really, I can't recommend it highly enough. You should all go listen. And I personally also feel Dr. Kimberly Manning needs her own show. How does that
Oh,
woman not
yeah,
have her own show?
I know.
She is spectacular. I kept wishing she was my mentor. I was so jealous of Ashley every time she would talk about her as being a guiding light in her life. I thought it was spectacular. And I'm also curious, for any of you who haven't heard, it's a mashup of people would just call in with their own audio diary, basically, and they were de-identified. And I was curious about that. What was the choice to have people not say who they were or give them the option in any case? I realized some people sharing something that, there could be retribution or there could be consequences for them sharing their testimony of something that had happened to them. But what about other people? What was the choice to make that anonymous?
Yeah. So the way that this unfolded, let me back up a bit. So we are a podcast, but we actually started as a live show. So often you'll have podcasts that will be a podcast and then they'll go on tour and do live shows. We were actually the opposite. So we were a live show first and a podcast second. And so the way that the podcast evolved organically is we would take live clips from the show, from the live show, play that, and you could hear the audience and everything, and then it would be followed by a conversation with the storyteller. So it was 30 minutes, story conversation, and we did that for 3 years, and that was the format. And in those podcast episodes, the storyteller was not anonymous. We gave their name and so on and so forth. Then when the pandemic hit, we did this new format, which was totally different, which is this tapestry of voices, the audio diaries. And we chose that format just because of the pandemic. And it was really in that setting where this question came up of how do we get the truth? And as many of you may know, around the pandemic, there were a lot of issues about physicians and nurses and other healthcare workers feeling like they couldn't speak up honestly about what was happening on the ground, and kind of their supervisors cracking down and trying to control the narrative and control the media. So that was actually the point where we gave people the option, and we said, do you want to be identified or do you want to be anonymous? And it was a mix. I would say some people were okay giving their name. Many chose a pseudonym and many chose to be anonymous. And as the series went on, we realized that there's all these choices to make around format. And so one option was to say, like, this is Emily's story, and then you hear it. And then this is Laurel's voice, and then you hear it. And then this is, Sarah's voice, and then you hear it. But we found that interjecting with like an introduction actually took away from this more sort of like floating in a sea of voices. And it was almost like you didn't even have to know who the person was. And it was just one voice after the other. And then we thought about at the end, should we kind of rattle off the names of who spoke in this episode, and ended up not doing that for a variety of reasons. So that was the precedent with the pandemic series. And then we had about 2 weeks off after the pandemic series before George Floyd happened and the news cycle exploded. And then we kind of turned it around and launched into Black Voices very quickly. And I think for us, we sort of snapped into the same production cycle and workflow and format as pandemic. And so the format that you see with Black Voices in large part is influenced by the work we were doing the 10 weeks before in pandemic. And I think similarly, we wanted people to feel free to express truths about, things that had happened to them in the hospital without, like you said, fearing retribution. And we did, again, give people the opportunity to give their name or not give their name. And we just kind of repeated a similar production cycle. But I think you bring up a good point, because in retrospect, actually looking at both series, I feel like there's pros and cons to anonymizing versus not. The main con is just giving people the opportunity to attach their name to the work, the same way that if they were to publish an essay in a journal or something, that they would want, to be credited for that work. And so it's actually something that we've been talking a lot about. Now that that heated moment has passed of the pandemic and some of the anxieties have dissipated, whether we want to go back and put people's names there and give the attributions. I think before we did do that, we would want to take the temperature of the people involved. And so that's something that we're still piecing together in the wake of this like explosion of creative material that we made like under very just rushed weekly cycles. So that's how it happened.
I think pros and cons is a great way to think about it. And, certainly people who do it are free to share it and say, this was me, right? I mean, people always have that option, which I think is interesting, and people may choose to take or not. One thing I loved about the tapestry of voices approach is that in my experience, medicine is deeply hierarchical. And it was so nice hearing this tapestry of voices and not realizing until maybe halfway through a story that you were listening to an orthopedic surgeon, versus a nurse's assistant. Or, sometimes I feel like in medicine, certain people's stories are privileged over other people's stories. Depending on specialty and depending on role, like on a care team. And I loved that aspect of this, where everyone's voices made up a really rich quilt of experiences about a variety of different topics without needing to know in advance, like, oh, now I am listening to a physician, or now I am listening to whoever. I thought that was a really nice choice, frankly, and kind of takes little bites out of what I think is, at least as an outside perspective, can be a deeply hierarchical system. So I thought that was lovely to hear. You mentioned the live show. The Nocturnist was a live show. I do want to talk about that. What is happening now? I mean, in a lot of ways, it's really wonderful. You started the podcast long before the pandemic, because you do have a way of still continuing to reach people. But what are you thinking now for the next step of Nocturnist, knowing that, everything is sort of upside down right now?
Yeah, it was pretty heartbreaking. We we had this big show in January, and it was such a rush. And we had planned another show in the spring, actually, to be in Seattle. We had some physicians up in Seattle who were interested in bringing us up there to produce a show there for them. And we had actually put out the call for submissions, picked a theme, hired and commissioned an artist to do illustrations for that show, and had the poster all ready to go. And then Seattle was actually one of the first cities hit by the pandemic. And so when that happened, we were all like, oh God, is it going to happen? Is it not? And at first, I think people had no idea how extensive this pandemic was going to be. So we're like, oh, maybe, by, I think this, was around February, March, and the show was planned for like middle or end of May. And we thought, oh, maybe it'll clear up by May, maybe it'll be fine. And then as time went on, it just became clear that that wasn't the case. So ended up postponing that show till September of this year, which obviously has already come and gone. And clearly this still isn't over. And so at this point, we've rescheduled that show to take place September of next year. And I don't know what the world's going to look like then, but we're hoping that by then we'll be able to execute that event. And then beyond that, we've really just put the live shows on hold. I think sometimes people ask about doing virtual events, and we've thought about it, but we haven't gone too far down that path. I think in part because part of what makes the Nocturnist so special is actually energetic and having to do with the choices that we make around venue and music and ambiance and setting and
Drinks. Don't forget the drinks.
and
Love
drinks. And really making it an experience where people are showing up. They're showing up to be entertained, but they're also showing up out of a deeper need. And so, dressing up, bringing a date, having a drink in your hand, sitting down, enjoying an evening, and having that sort of emotional catharsis. And I'm just not sure how easily that would be replicated over the virtual setting, where everything's so flattened and everything feels the same. And so it's something we're continuing to ponder, but at the moment, we don't have any plans for live storytelling by Zoom.
What I really hope is that on the other side of this, we are all so hungry to be together in spaces where we see each other in 3 dimensions again, and we can smell someone's cologne even if we don't like it. Like, I never knew how much I would miss that.
Right.
And just to be together, I think you're totally right. The camaraderie in those rooms that you have created is just so spectacular. And one thing that I've always really admired too is like the age diversity, I will say, in those rooms. Some of the youngest physicians I know and some of the oldest physicians, and same with others, and I think that's such a nice thing. And that doesn't often happen in clinic, and doesn't happen in medical school, and doesn't happen in training. So I think there's such a nice vibe in those rooms, and it's so celebratory and it's so supportive of the people on stage. I think you've done a lot to create a really safe space where people feel like they could get vulnerable. And maybe medicine is not that encouraging of vulnerability at all times, which I'd like to actually talk to you about. Can we talk about vulnerability? I'm curious. I love a good vulnerable story. And I feel like one of the things that makes me most interested in medical stories is that so often you're seeing behind a curtain where you feel like the person talking isn't necessarily used to sharing stories where they are vulnerable, or where they've made a mistake, or they wish they had done something differently, or sharing something maybe that they had felt ashamed about, or worried about, or scared about. And even the funniest stories I've seen in Nocturnists often have an element of deep vulnerability about them. And I'm curious if that's something you look for, and if that's something that you've found in yourself. Has this made you more likely to share the personal with your colleagues and strangers?
Definitely. I think there is this myth of the physician hero or the physician savior or the physician god or what have you, and not just physicians, other healthcare workers too. But because I'm a physician, it kind of started out that way, and I just think a lot about physicians and physicianhood, and it's a lie. For better or for worse, physicians, aren't all powerful, perfect, all knowing beings. We have bodies. I think one of the messages we receive throughout our medical education is you don't have a body. Like you don't need sleep, you don't need, all these things. And we do have bodies and we get sick. And there's a lot of really rich conversations happening right now about physicians who are living with illness, whether it's mental illness or some other chronic condition, and how we can support people who have bodies that are affected by the same diseases that affect our patients, and how we can help support them through medical training. So I think, that's a reality. I think talking about physicians and just mental health, obviously mental illness is a part of that, but also just coping around the secondary trauma that we absorb on the job and the way that we're really pushed to our limits is important to talk about. And then also just dispersing some of the shame around uncertainty and doubt, and just allowing space to hold that. I think physicians, in a way, their job is to take things that are ambiguous and make them certain. The idea being, somebody comes to the emergency room and they have abdominal pain and no one knows what it is. And your job is to take that ambiguous thing and to just drill it down and make it very, very certain, and diagnose it and treat it and make it go away. And that's like really woven into our identity. And so when there is something that comes up that's ambiguous and that you can't reduce into like a linear, logical, like rational thing, it can be really hard to sit with that. And I think sometimes people like take it personally, like they take it as a personal affront or a personal attack that like they're not able to fix this problem. And I think it kind of makes you hate yourself in a way that can come out through the way that you actually treat those patients who are living with diseases that aren't well explained. So, or diseases that are well explained, but that don't have cures necessarily and are chronic or terminal. So, yeah, I just kind of want to blow out that stereotype and give physicians the opportunity to tap into their own humanity. And that does include their vulnerability and mistakes, doubts, uncertainty, sickness, quirks. I think quirks and like tics I feel like are fun to highlight in physicians too, because I feel like sometimes the message is that like you can't have a personality. And there's sort of this idea that like if you have an authenticity or if you have anything about you that's eccentric or weird or like that's somehow not okay, and you have to sort of smother that down. And like those are the things that I love about people, is like whatever weird thing that they have, like that's what makes me fall in love with them. So those are some of the things that we're looking for.
I love that. I love your phrase about dispersing shame and doubt, as if we can spread it all out and it becomes less of a heavy burden. Teresa, am I saying your name right? Teresa, who's a nurse practitioner, says this is such great stuff. I experienced all that you were talking about. Thank you for calling it out, sharing. I agree, and I feel like a lot of students that I work with, medical and PA students, are worried about that and are worried about being themselves. In fact, one of my students, Candace Kim, did a wonderful piece for you a couple of years ago about wearing leather pants to her white coat ceremony and being the only person who hadn't worn a dress and feeling so much shame and being shamed by her parents and looking around and realizing, not only was she one of the only seemingly apparently queer people there and gender non-conforming, but also she was the only person in leather pants, and wondering if really she could be a physician even if she wasn't wearing pearl studs and like some sort of like Ann Taylor sweater set. And so one thing that I think you're doing that's so amazing is showing people all of the different ways to be a healthcare professional, and that's not just allowed, but that there's actually richness in that. And I think that's a beautiful thing about storytelling. And I love what you said too about not being able, the shame that may come with not being able to distill an answer down for somebody or to fix them, or by extension oneself. And I wonder if there is an element in storytelling that helps you as a physician. Is there something like the lack of finite answers in how to tell a good story that helps you in your practice? What's the relationship from storytelling to your practice?
Oof, yeah. It's funny because when I was coming of age in high school, college, and so on and so forth, I always viewed myself as a writer. I was like, I love to read and I'm a writer and I want to do creative writing. And I still love writing and I'm trying to write, and that's a separate conversation. But I feel like there's writing and then there's storytelling. And I've been thinking a lot about like medium and how kind of strange it is that I just fell into this medium of like audio. It's just something really unexpected. I never, had a moment where I was like, I choose audio, or I choose the spoken word. It just happened. It's just like the universe kind of, it was like, here, this is this is what you're doing. And so it became less writing and more storytelling, which I feel like is a broader term. And then applying storytelling to the work with physicians and creativity. But as of late, I've been realizing how everything is storytelling. Um, and I've been doing some like spiritual explorations and just thinking about like, the storytelling elements that are happening like at galactic scales. But anyway, we can talk about that later. But I think when you're talking about things like one's relationship to oneself, that's where we begin, right? So before we enter into a dialogue with another person, whether it's partner, patient, whatever, like just kind of understanding the relationship to oneself and the way that storytelling plays into that. And so I've been playing around with these really interesting exercises where you can tell the story of your life 6 different ways, and they're just sentences that you're putting together, and each way it might sound like totally convincing and totally true, and it's just a matter of how you choose to tell that story. So for example, like if I decide that I'm a generous person, I can look back at my life and kind of cherry pick moments in my life where I was really generous and string those together into like a really convincing narrative, and then suddenly my identity is that I'm generous. I could also tell the narrative that I'm just like a selfish person and look back on my life and find moments where I was selfish and string them together and tell that story. And I think that the stories we tell ourselves and how they play into like how we occur to ourselves and to our identity is just something really, really interesting and really fascinating, and can affect the way that we show up, for ourselves. And so that's something that I've been thinking about. And then once you enter into dialogue with someone else, um, asking that person, like, what's your deal? Like, how do you occur to yourself? I've had people who are unhoused and really struggling with substance use disorders who have like just really like raw authentic confidence and this like swagger, and they're just like in their body. And then I've had people who are more affluent and just they're like shrunken, they're contracted, and they're telling themselves a story about themselves that isn't very nice. So I think when I'm interacting with patients, I do try to approach them with a narrative sensitivity, especially because I'm a hospitalist. So for those of you who don't know, I'm not in the office. I take care of people during moments in their life where things are coming to a climax in this hospitalization. And I really view that moment as an opportunity to kind of pause the narrative and just sit down with someone and say, how is life going? How do you see yourself? And then just ask them, like, what do you want to happen next? Like, where do you want the story to go from here? And then once you figure out what it is that they're hoping for, then you can use that lens to drive their healthcare in that direction. So maybe I'll stop there.
Oh, I think that's wonderful. I love this idea of you as a hospitalist appearing at the climax in everyone else's story too, right? Like you probably feature very prominently in most of the people's lives who you interact with, even if you only see them once on a shift. You are meeting them at the moment where they may have the highest stakes, and are making some of the biggest decisions in their lives. And one thing I hope as physicians and nurses and other healthcare professionals gets trained and further training and experience in the art of storytelling is that they are better able in these very short periods of time where the stakes are so high to communicate clearly, with empathy, and clarity to people who may not have the same vocabularies that they do. And I feel like that's something that I have seen, from the non-healthcare professional angle, but as somebody who has had various forays into the medical system, how often that communication breaks down not because of any ill will on the provider's part, but perhaps because they've been in school for years and years, but were never trained
Right.
in the arts of communication. And we're trained with something like, an acronym that includes like touch arm now to show empathy. And I think good storytellers naturally have empathy. They have senses of humor often. They exude warmth. They are committed to capturing people's attention. And it seems a shame to me that so often the people most charged with our care and most charged with helping us walk through really difficult concepts often that we're hearing for the first time when we have to make decisions about them, really aren't good storytellers. So I think what you're doing not only is it important for the physicians, but absolutely, it's really important for the rest of us too. I don't care that my physician is entertaining, but I sure as hell want them to be clear and compassionate, and to help me understand something that I didn't even know I had, for example, 24 hours ago, or to help me make a decision for my parent or a loved one or something. So,
Right.
I think what you're doing is really profound, both for the individuals, but also, for everyone that they come across, because the ripples are just gigantic. For anyone's here, tell us in the chat. Cynthia Keeley says thoughts on Abraham Verghese's work. Do you have thoughts on Abraham Verghese's work?
Oh my gosh, I've heard so many wonderful things about Abraham and his work, and his book, Cutting for Stone, I know is such a touchstone, no pun intended, for so many medical students. And I have not read it, and I need to. He may have come out with another book since then, but I'm especially interested in that book because it's a novel, and I'm actually trying to write fiction right now. So I can't comment. I see in the comments she's saying, read it. I will definitely move it up my list, Cynthia, because I've heard it's fantastic. Maybe Laurel, do you know Abraham? I know you're down at Stanford.
Yeah, I don't know it personally, but I'm a big fan of his, and I actually really recommend his nonfiction too. He does a lot of narrative nonfiction journalism about medicine, which I think is great. Cynthia says after AIDS, he wrote on tennis and airplanes. Like any good writer, they do not stick to one topic. Yeah, something I just wanted to flag for you, which is that maybe will make writing a little bit easier, is that I don't think there's a difference between storytelling and writing. One you're doing with your
Right.
vocal cords and one you're doing with your fingertips. And if there's anything that you can do to make your fingertips feel more like your voice, whether it's like writing this new fiction draft in like an email form, or whether, what I always do when I'm stuck, I don't know if this helps you or will help anyone here, but I will do an audio recording to myself, because so often, like when I sit down to be like professional gifted Laurel at the keyboard, something happens and I just like can't get it out, where like in the shower 5 minutes earlier, like I knew exactly what I wanted to say and it was so beautiful in the shower, and as soon as I sit down to get it to come through my hands, it's so damn hard. So audio is a way that I get around that. I'll really just talk into my iPhone microphone and then I'll upload it to get transcribed, and then read the transcription. And sometimes that's a way in, and I just like really feel like anything we can do to really crash through those walls is good for everybody, particularly now because people are listening more than they're reading. So it won't matter. Even if you write a book, still more people will probably listen to the audio version. So don't worry about it too much. Everyone's going to consume it with earbuds anyway. Alyssa says, very off topic question. Sorry, but can a book have multiple point of views? Absolutely. Yes, Alyssa. Of course. Let's see. I'm trying to read the last one that I think the overstory. Read the overstory for multiple points of view. Read Terry Jones. Read American Marriage. That's an incredible book from this last year that has multiple viewpoints. Cynthia says, I just had a student interviewed on camera for 5 hours for a 5-minute storytelling piece that was on CBS Essential Workers show on Tuesday at 9. Awesome. Watch Myra, witness big difference between storytelling and writing. Yes, but we should all be aiming to not have a big difference between storytelling and writing. I think the best writing sounds like storytelling. Emily, tell us what kind of stories you're looking for. I know you said vulnerability, but would you be specific? What's your dream story that comes in over the transom at Nocturnist? What are you looking for?
Yeah, it's funny. I had a friend, I was talking to a friend a while ago, and she said something to me that was really interesting. And what she said was, I love the space that you've created for the Nocturnists. I love how you've given people the opportunity to express things like shame, sadness, fear, grief, all the tears, all of that. And she said, and that's great. But she was like, what I'm craving is, she was like, Emily, like, you have this like swagger. And I was like, what? And she was like, I want your storytellers to have swagger. Like and that it really landed in my body in that moment. And I think it kind of ties into what we were talking about earlier about like healthcare workers feeling like they need to suppress their authenticity and like, well, what if I want to show up at my white coat ceremony in my leather pants? Like, what about that? And so I think all of the vulnerability stuff, like, yes, absolutely. But I would get really excited to hear a story that is just somebody who is like really in their like maybe someone with a little bit of a rebellious streak, or I guess the leather pants, like, right, we traditionally associate like the leather jacket and the cigarette with like the rebel, like bad kid. I guess right now I'm kind of in the mood to hear stories from people who are rejecting or eschewing, if that's how you pronounce that, the sort of good girl or good boy doctor stereotype, and who are tapping into a sense of rebelliousness, a sense of going against the grain, of doing something different, of kind of shaking things up. Because I think we all know that healthcare, it's many decades behind. It's not exactly the industry that you think of when you think of like rapid innovation and keeping up with the times. I mean, certainly there's been huge strides in biomedical advancement, but like, for God's sake, we're still using pagers and it's 2020. And, the hospital's set up, to operate the same way that it was decades ago. And it's not relevant anymore. We need a refresh. We need fresh ideas, fresh people, fresh minds. And so people who are coming to the table with that sense of just being different and not being afraid to leave the pack and do something else, that's something I'm feeling really drawn to right now.
Great. Well, I hope you create an entire generation of rebellious physicians. In my experience, it's really hard, especially, physicians, I'd say at Stanford, bless their hearts, who I love and am honored to work with. But I think the profession rewards people who have identified hoops and who have jumped through those hoops with great finesse for years and years and years. And it's really hard to switch from your like fellowship application voice into a really authentic radical voice. That's the thing that's going to really like pull people in on the page and the stage. And I think, it's maybe an unfair thing, for me to assume that they can pivot to that voice and be vulnerable. And in fact, particularly I would say with Black physicians I'm working with, they really felt that they couldn't do that there was ramifications for doing that until very, very recently. Like I'd say in the last few months, few weeks, that people are really storytelling as their full selves institutionally in front of their colleagues and their supervisors and their division and their chairs and everything else. And I think, there is a reason people couldn't be their authentic selves in medicine, but it's also a little bit chicken or the egg, right? And so, I think sometimes it's the working with you, it's the telling the live story that shows somebody that they can be that person,
Right.
that they can bring that swagger, into their practice and they can be themselves. That actually came up in one of your recent podcast episodes with Dr. Kimberly Manning speaking about that. And really refusing to code switch at the hospital. And I really love that. I thought that was one of the most moving bits of audio I've heard in a really long time. And she talked about how she spoke to everybody and how once she really changed her voice and how she really refused to do that anymore. And I thought that was so profound. And that's an example of, she was doing it on her own. But I think sometimes telling a live story in front of your peers can do it for you, because you hear those applause afterwards. It kind of sets you free. And I think, the more we can do in healthcare, the better, in terms of showing people that not only can they bring their full selves to the job, but also they're rewarded for it. And I really hope that means we can all be brazenly ourselves, even if it doesn't look like the doctor we thought we had to be when we were kids or something, which would be great. Um, what's a nocturnist? Where did the idea for where did the title come from? Is this a hospitalist that's on at night?
Yes. So a nocturnist is a doctor who works at night. Um, and uh, I put together this live show in January 2016, and I was like, all right, what am I going to call it? And I think naming things is so fun. And I had a list of like a dozen names, and a lot of them were really bad. And I went over to my friend Rob's house, and he was cooking dinner, and I just stood there in his kitchen and I read all 12 of them. And the reason I chose Rob is he is one of my friends that is like the most stylish. And I wanted to get like the Rob stamp of approval. So I went down and I got to the Nocturnist, and he was like stirring something, and then he like stopped stirring and he looked up and he was like, ooh. And then I was like, that's it. So I just picked it and went with it. And I think it works well. What I like about it is, the events obviously take place in the evening. So there's that literal like coming together at night, nocturnist piece of it. But I think there's also something about the nighttime vibes. Like visually, there's a lot of purple, there's a lot of like blue, there's a lot of moon energy. It has definitely a little bit more of a feminine energy. And I think somewhat of a subversive energy, the idea being like, okay, like what's the stuff that happens at night that nobody talks about, or the idea of darkness or some kind of shroud that you're uncovering, or secrets, or something like that. So and then I also just like that it's a plural noun. So it's like all of us in this room together tonight, like we are the Nocturnists, like collectively, we are the Nocturnists. So I always say that we're a family, we're a community. And once you're a part of the family and the community, you're a Nocturnist, just like the rest of us.
I love that. I also love the idea of like the hospital at night being a kind of quieter place where maybe you get to hear more of these stories, and it's really interesting and fun to me. Have you ever had any patients come to the shows, and how do you deal with that? Thinking both in your own experience writing about patients. I know this is an ethically interesting territory. And also, do you encourage patients ever to come to the shows? In my experience, it's felt very much more like the shows are for healthcare workers themselves. But I'm assuming, some of us are also patients. But how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, we're all patients because we all have bodies. But I think when I was putting this together, there's just a lot of organizations out there that are dedicated to patients, patient experience, patient stories, patient storytelling, patient advocacy, and things like that. And I think that is so important. But I think the gap that I was identifying for myself anyway was like, well, what about from this side of things? Like, what about the caregivers? Like, I don't know. There are moments where I feel like I was put on this earth, perhaps not so much to be a doctor of patients, but to be like a doctor of doctors, or like a caregiver of caregivers. Like, who is caring for the caregivers? And that's a question I ask myself a lot. And I continue to ask myself, and I think is a big problem in healthcare, because I'm not sure there's a clear answer to that question. And so it was a moment where I was kind of like, I mean, I'll help. Like, this is my offering. And so I think carving out that kind of creative niche, and being really clear about who we are and what we do, and who we aren't and what we don't do, and making that decision, how to decide. The word decide ends in "ide," and it means to kill. So like, when you're deciding who you are, you're also deciding who you're not. And so I think definitely kind of branding ourselves as more of stories from healthcare workers. That said, we've had a lot of really interesting stories come in of like doctor as patient or nurse as patient, and just exploring that liminal space of like, you know, it's almost like code switching in a different way. It's like you have the doctor mask on, but then you come home and you take it off and you're a patient, and just kind of navigate that. So those stories have been really interesting. And then we've also had a lot of people ask about, would we ever consider a podcast or a live show where we have doctors and patients in conversation with each other? And that's something that I've sort of shied away from in the past because of everything I've just said. Still trying to like find our footing in the other space before we broaden. But I think as time goes on, is something that could be really interesting and powerful, and would definitely have to be done very thoughtfully and you know, intentionally. So
That's awesome. You know, someone, a mentor of mine that I trust a lot, said to me once, you know, you're defined much more by what you say no to than what you say yes to. And I think that's especially true when designing events and everything else. You know, you, as so many people risk making an event for quote unquote everyone, which doesn't exist anyway, that they end up making something for no one. Um, Cynthia says, as a new grad night nurse at the NICU Stanford in July 1980s with new residents, the new residents would wake up and say, and thank me for correcting the doctor's orders because he was a blurry thinking nocturnist. There is something about the teamwork that goes on under a full moon. It's really sweet. Yeah, and I think that speaks to a lot of the kinds of stories that we've been hearing. Also in pandemic, in that audio series that you guys have put out recently too, you know, the teamwork is a tapestry, and that we need all of us, and the better communicators we are on those teams, you know, the better. I also want to steal that phrase doctor of doctors from you. I'll give you full attribution, but I think that's great.
I mean, that's what you are.
Days, that's what I'm doing too. And I think, you know, I didn't even know there was a need for it. You know, I was raised by a physician who was chronically ill for almost the entire time that he was practicing, and had so much shame around it, not being able to heal himself. And I think that seeped into my very bone marrow. And I've always known physicians or people, and in my own grad training, you know, we're here for science, the science festival. I think this is true in doctoral programs as well for the sciences. You might as well be a brain in a jar on a skateboard, you know, like your body is not supposed to have needs. To admit to those needs is seen as weakness. And I think that's something that it's not just medicine, it's science across the board as well. And I hope that's really changing, because the truth is we will be better care providers. We will be better rigorous thinkers if we slept well and we've had time to chase sticks with the dog, and, you know, go out and breathe some fresh air occasionally. So I think, you know, stories is a really powerful way to remind ourselves how badly we need that. One thing that someone said recently that I loved, and I'd kind of like to know what is in your captain's log. One of the things in the pandemic pieces, and also in Black Voices, that I really loved, someone said, I can't remember what episode, maybe it was in Becoming, it was a female physician, and she said her life suddenly feels like every day feels like a captain's log right now.
Yeah.
And it really stuck with me. I thought that was such a beautiful phrase. I would like to give her attribution, but I don't know who she was. You do. Thank her for me. But I'm curious, you know, I want to know how everyone is dealing with this time. Obviously, you're dealing with this time by putting out great audio. How are you personally dealing with this time? How are you balancing being a hospitalist in a once in a century pandemic with being a spouse and being a human and showing up for as a doctor of doctors?
Yeah. Gosh, I was sort of trying to find the balance between the medical and the creative even before the pandemic, and made the decision to go part time on the clinical work. And so even part-time on the clinical work, though, it's a lot of work, and when I am on it, it's very draining. And then the pandemic hit, and then I did have to go into the hospital and work these shifts and the COVID shifts and so on and so forth. I think, you know, I've always been someone who like takes reality and filters it through the arts as a way of making sense of things. I've always been someone who is like standing there with a camera, or, you know, writing about things, or making little silly videos of my friends, and wanting to capture and document, but not necessarily document in like a sterile way, but hang a frame around it in a way where it becomes beautiful, even if it isn't. And it's just this impulse that I've always had. And when the pandemic hit, you know, the infrastructure of the Nocturnists already existed. We had this nervous system out to the physician community and the healthcare community at large. And it was really a moment where it was wanting to be in service of the community, certainly, but for me personally, it was like, it was almost like I imagine if a war photographer goes to a war zone and there's explosions happening all around, but there's this like weird psychological safety that you have from behind the camera lens where there's a distance there. It's like if you turn the tragedy into an object, or you turn the tragedy into a story, or you turn the tragedy into an art project or something like that, somehow like it becomes less scary and more approachable. And that was definitely true for me. I would lay in bed at 9 p.m. with my headphones, listening to all these voices of strangers across the country. And like, it was a lot of consciousness to hold for sure, but it also just made it feel like okay in a weird way. And then we did the 10 episodes. And then a few months later, I went back and listened to them. And then it was really then where I was like, oh, wow, like this happened. I think while we were making it, and for those who don't know, we made it in the style of Saturday Night Live. So we would like release an episode on a Tuesday and then turn around and look at what came in the week before, make an episode, release on a Tuesday. We did that every week for 10 weeks. So it was exhausting, but it was also, it gave us something to do. It gave us a purpose. And I feel like I was numb throughout that process. And then it wasn't until later where I thought like, wow, okay, now I can kind of metabolize what happened. And I'm really glad that I had this distraction in the moment. So that's for the art part of it. And then in terms of personally, I'm really lucky. You know, the Bay Area, thank God, has fared relatively well compared to other cities in this country. At our hospital, we've had some PPE shortage, but nothing like the things you saw in the news of people wrapped in trash bags and, you know, 2 people to a ventilator and things like that. We haven't had. And, you know, I have a husband who I've been attending to and he's been attending to me, but we don't have kids. So haven't had to deal with, gosh, I don't know how people, you know, homeschooling virtually and all of that. So, excuse me. At the end of the day, I feel like I've been really lucky and not surprisingly, the Nocturnist has just continued to save me again and again when difficult things happen. So
One thing I find is if you make something that saves you, doubtlessly it's going to save at least one other person. You know, sometimes it saves millions, sometimes it just saves you and like 2 people. It doesn't matter really. But I think you did. I think all of this work, you're making containers for something that we're still in. You know, right now, like the pandemic is still the water. You know that David Foster Wallace commencement speech I highly recommend. You know, right now the pandemic is the water, and where I feel like these times for us, for so many different reasons, we will be sense making of this time for so many generations to come, for so many years to come, and right now we're still in it. And so I think so much of what we're doing now as creative people is like making time capsules, that who knows what. I'm trying to not try to understand what's happening right now, and just survive it and just take notes on it so that future versions of us can help us make sense of it. But I think you're really doing that. And it reminds me, what is the phrase? There was a physician in episode 5 of Black Voices that was talking about collaterals, which I believe were things that open up in the cardiovascular system when there's a blockage that bring joy. And she used it as a metaphor. And that just brought me to my knees. I just love that idea. And I think that's what you're doing. This is a collateral, you know, and damn it, we just need more of them. Do we have any other questions? 20 silent participants in this conversation who are not silent. Thank you so much, Cynthia and Lisa and Catherine and Teresa. Is there anybody else with any questions for Emily? Or about life, or existentially? There's also a God voice on this call who's, I think, we can ask him questions too. But if no questions, I will just thank you. Is there anything, Emily, I didn't ask you that you wish I'd asked?
No, I'll just say thank you so much to the folks that showed up. And if you want to learn more about the Nocturnists and what we're doing, you can just visit the website. It's thenocturnist.com. And we have some exciting plans brewing for 2021. I think this fall we're kind of collecting ourselves, and you know, election is happening and everything. Vote, by the way, everyone. Um, January 2021, we're going to be launching some exciting new projects, including a project that specifically looks at the emotion of shame, and examining the culture of medicine through that lens. And so if that sounds interesting and exciting to you and something that you want to participate in, I encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. That way, when the call for submissions comes out for audio clips, you will be the first to know, and then you can send in your voice, and who knows, your voice could be on a Nocturnist episode sometime very soon.
Oh, great. Also, I will put in a brief plug. I teach a free workshop every other Saturday for healthcare workers. And you can sign up for that too. If you want to work on a draft to send Emily as a story, you can work with me. And I can put the link in the chat, but it's writingmedicine.org. And you can find me there. But thank you all so much. This is weird because this is just the times we live in. But Emily, it is an absolute joy to see you. I'm sorry we are not drinking in person. It's time for me to refill my glass. I hope you have something close by to refill.
Yes. Well, thank you for doing this. Thanks for coming, and thanks to everyone else. And yeah, onward.
Absolutely. Take care of yourself. Stay healthy, all of you. Thanks for coming. I'm going, oh, great. Cynthia has 2 Black med students. I told them about Nocturnists. Maybe they have stories to share. Bet they do. Bet you all do. All right. Yep. Hope to hear your voices on the Nocturnist soon. All right. Bye, all.